Oregon has a long history of white supremacy and hate groups, from black exclusion laws to neo-Nazi skinheads and the Proud Boys. Now, a coalition from Oregon is asking the White House for federal funding to help fight racism in the state.
We have a history here. It's a real problem. Oregon is at the center of a lot of this stuff, but the impact on the community is widespread and deep.
Plus, homeless veterans say they lived in terrible conditions in apartments paid for by the city of Portland and Multnomah County.
The ceiling collapsed and the building was condemned.
And a new audit found the government wasted a bunch of money instead of fixing the problems or moving the veterans somewhere else.
It kind of struck us as maybe one of the worst things that can happen.
Here's the story.
And hey there, I'm Ashley Korslund in for Pat Doris tonight. Welcome to The Story. All the ways to get in touch with us are at the bottom of your screen. You can email us at thestory@kgw.com. Use the hashtag TheStoryKGW on Twitter or leave us a voicemail. You can call our number 503-226-5090. Let's get to our big story now. This week, the House committee investigating the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol will begin holding public hearings. At the same time, organizations representing communities of color in Oregon have written a letter to the president asking him to combat white supremacy through investing in communities of color. And while white supremacy might not immediately conjure thoughts of the insurrection, experts say there is a connection. Here's Christine Pitawanich.
I spoke with the head of Latino Network, Tony DeFalco, about a letter that his organization, along with 6 other organizations representing communities of color across Oregon, wrote to President Biden. That letter asks the president to invest $100 million into the Oregon nonprofits to combat white supremacy and the effects it has on communities of color. They say it's needed, especially in the wake of violence like the shooting in Buffalo, New York, where 10 people died and the suspect is being charged with murder as a hate crime.
These are times in which we're seeing increasing domestic violent extremist activity, not just nationally, but here in Oregon.
Tony DeFalco and others are ready for the federal government to act.
We have a federal administration currently that has a stated commitment to stamping out white supremacy in this country. And we really have been ready for that action.
According to a report out of the Secretary of State's office, Oregon ranks 6th in the country in violent extremist attacks.
That has all of our communities on edge.
That report looked at sort of a 10-year period of extremism on all parts of the political spectrum, left-wing, right-wing. A lot of that was the summer of 2020. So there was a fairly even divide.
Even so, Randall Blazak, chair of the Oregon Coalition Against Hate Crimes, says the Pacific Northwest, and Oregon in particular, does have a long history with white supremacy, going back to the founding of the state.
The Klan ran the state in the 1920s. We've had skinhead violence, and now we have Proud Boy violence. In many ways, Oregon is seen as kind of the last bastion of white America.
He says it's documented. The Pacific Northwest has a lot of people who support ideology connected to white supremacy and extremism.
There was a study that was done after the January 6th riots in the Capitol that found that the highest internet search activity that was asking, how do I overthrow the government, or how do I join the Proud Boys, or how do I join the right-wing movement, was coming from Oregon. That we were the #1 state for people searching out how to overthrow the government.
Speaking of January 6th, a number of people in Oregon allegedly participated, and Blazak says events in Oregon are believed to be tied to it.
The warm-up for January 6th was in Salem in December when they attacked the state capitol in Salem. That was a precursor to January 6th, and so here we are right at the center of it again.
And he says there is a real connection between white supremacy and the insurrection.
January 6th wouldn't have happened if there hadn't been the kind of permission to blame COVID on Asians and talk about immigration from the southern border as an invasion, and all the kind of racist dog whistles that really ginned up the white supremacist movement and pushed more people into that funnel.
Here's the deal with that funnel he's talking about. At the top are issues like government overreach or immigration. Now, generally speaking, people who are concerned about those types of things probably wouldn't consider themselves white supremacists, right? But Blazak says for some, it can be a slippery slope.
Where there are these levels to the funnel. At the top, are these relatively mainstream issues, gun rights and COVID lockdowns. And then it becomes a hatred of the government. And then it becomes a conspiracy theory that the government, is controlled by other people.
Then he says conspiracy theories can target groups of people.
And then that conspiracy theory becomes an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, is sort of stealth racism. I'm not a racist, but...
At the bottom of the funnel are the people who have bought into conspiracy theories masked as truth on the internet, and they may choose violence.
This notion we own this country, our country is being taken away from us by them. But that's why those of us in my community, our hair is on fire, because there is a real threat from these groups.
And that threat can look like different acts of violence, some of which can impact communities of color. People carrying trauma from what they've seen happen to other people who look like them. The
bottom line is, yeah, we have a history here. It's a real problem. Oregon is at the center of a lot of this stuff, but the impact on the community is widespread and deep.
Blazak, who has studied and taught college courses on hate crimes and extremism, says around the world, authoritarianism is on the rise. And while many of us believe our democracy is immune to it, he says it's not guaranteed. Christine Pitawanich, KGW News.
Let's take a closer look at Oregon's history of white supremacy. It goes all the way back to before Oregon was even a state. In the 1800s, the government of the Oregon Territory passed what were called black exclusion laws. Black people were not allowed to settle in the territory or own any property. Those laws became part of the Constitution when Oregon became a state in 1859. Voters eventually repealed those laws in 1926, but the actual language was not removed from the state constitution until 2002. And at the time, 30% of voters wanted to keep that racist language in. In the early 1900s, the Ku Klux Klan was booming in Oregon. Oregon actually had the largest KKK membership per capita in the entire country. And they helped get racist politicians elected, including Governor Walter M. Pierce in 1922. Also, like a lot of cities around the country, Portland was no stranger to redlining. Banks denied mortgages to people of color in certain areas that created segregated neighborhoods. Take a look. This map shows how Portland was divided up back in 1940. Those red areas, those were labeled hazardous because of, quote, undesirable populations. The federal government banned the practice of redlining in the 1970s after the civil rights movement, but the effects of it are still doing resounding harm to this day. Okay, in the 1980s and the 90s, Portland became known as Skinhead City because of neo-Nazi groups based here. In 1988, 3 skinheads murdered an Ethiopian immigrant named Mulugeta Sarah. Here's a clip from the KGW Vault.
The crime took place here on Southeast 31st early Sunday morning. 3 black men, all from Ethiopia, were sitting in this car talking. When one left to head for his apartment, another car pulled up. 3 young white men jumped out and began beating him. The other 2 Ethiopians never had a chance to stop it.
They have some kind of a stick or steel, I don't know. Just immediately they come, just hit and follow him around and kick him. After that, when I try to open the door, just immediately they hit me and I start the car, try to move, and they hit the car, broke everything.
There were also 2 women with the 3 skinheads, women who stayed in their car but who shouted encouragement.
Well, one of Sarah's killers was sentenced to life in prison where he died in 2011. The other 2 got shorter sentences and are both out of prison. In fact, last year, reporters with the Oregonian and Willamette Week spotted one of those men at a pro-Trump demonstration outside the Oregon State Capitol. That was on January 6th, 2021. He was also seen at a Proud Boys rally in Portland in 2020. Now, speaking of the Proud Boys, they are designated as a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center, and they have spent a lot of time in Portland and Southwest Washington staging rallies and fighting with left-wing groups. The Federal Justice Department just charged the leader of the Proud Boys and 4 other members with seditious conspiracy in the U.S. Capitol attack. They are scheduled to go on trial in August. Now let's go to our homeless crisis. A new report finds Portland's Joint Office of Homeless Services wasted hundreds of thousands of dollars of taxpayer money on a property that was falling apart. It was used to house homeless veterans who say the conditions there were just awful. Blair Best looked into it.
For the past 6 years, that money was going toward rent for formerly homeless veterans. This whole investigation started when the city received a tip to their fraud hotline saying that the apartment complex called Sandy Studios, located on Northeast Sandy Boulevard, was unsafe and unlivable. The investigation ultimately found that the Joint Office spent more than $850,000 for veterans to live there.
It kind of struck us as maybe one of the worst things that can happen.
Casey Jones runs Portland's Audit Services, which reviews city programs and funds. He says this investigation was unlike any other, and that it found the Joint Office of Homeless Services spent more than $850,000 to shelter veterans in this 2-story apartment complex, but allowed it to, quote, deteriorate into unsafe, unsanitary housing that ultimately left the Joint Office scrambling to find shelter for the residents.
And eventually, in the beginning of 2021, the ceiling collapsed and the building was condemned.
The report goes on to say last January, a building inspector found a, quote, collapsed ceiling and damaged roof that allowed water to enter the building, along with dangerous levels of mold in nearly all the apartments caused by moisture and damage. There is no record of repairs being made, but the Joint Office says they did. The report claims the Joint Office struggled to find new housing for the tenants due to COVID restrictions. The city says while the Joint Office was trying to move tenants out of the unsafe building, they were still moving people in.
I think that the folks who weren't homeless during the pandemic might disagree with that assessment. It really was, I think, needs to be always held in the context of this was the height of the pandemic.
Joint Office policies require annual risk assessments of their properties. They did not perform these assessments at Sandy Studios in 2019 or 2020. The city auditor's office now recommending the Joint Office to do 4 things: inform staff of contract requirements and enforce them, address employee conflicts, meaning separate those in charge of policy enforcement with those responsible for supporting the nonprofit providers, ensure high-risk areas of a property are monitored, and follow up on reports and problems. The Joint Office is now hiring more staff to meet these recommendations.
We know that there were things that were important pieces for us to take away and learn.
The city will check back in with the Joint Office in about a year to see how they're doing with these recommendations. It's also important to note that people are still living in this building. It's owned and operated by a private company, and we were there today, and the staff there tells us that they're making repairs and working with the city to pass inspections. Blair Best, KGW News.
A lot of people use marijuana for medical purposes, but a new OHSU study found it doesn't actually do much for chronic pain. And speaking of drugs, we're checking in on the state of Oregon's magic mushroom program. That's next in Vice News when the story continues.
Hey, welcome back. Keep sending your questions and your comments to thestory@kgw.com or give us a call and leave a voicemail at 503-226-5090. Oh, now to one of our favorite segments. It's called Vice News, and it's where we talk about all of our vices. Tonight, we are focusing on drugs. First up, marijuana. A lot of people obviously use it recreationally, but many people use it for medical reasons, including pain management. Well, a new OHSU study just found that there's actually not much evidence that cannabis helps chronic pain, at least in the long term. Researchers did find a few of THC products that provide short-term relief, specifically for nerve pain. But again, they say there's not much evidence beyond that. All right, let's move on to psilocybin, also known as magic mushrooms. You probably remember in 2020, Oregon voters legalized them, but only for use in licensed therapeutic settings. There are a bunch of restrictions too. You cannot buy them at a store, take them home to use, or grow them yourself. And the state is still in a 2-year development period to work all the details out. But this week, they did take a step forward. Groups that train people to become licensed in psilocybin therapy can now apply to work with the state. But people who want to actually become licensed, well, they can't start that process until next year. So if you're interested in actually getting psilocybin therapy, it is going to be a while. All right, let's switch to sports now. Remember when the Blazers were good enough to win a championship? Well, for that, we have to go back to 1977. The team won the NBA Finals 45 years ago this week. Here's a look back at the celebration in the KGW Vault.
It was the only game of the series that was really close. Portland had been up by as many as 15 points, but it all came down to the last 16 seconds. When, trailing by 2 points, the Sixers forced a jump ball with Bobby Gross. A bucket here would tie it up. But Julius Erving could not add to his 40 points. Gross battled Lloyd Free's attempt out of bounds. And George McGinnis' shooting slump came to an end in this game, but he couldn't make the one shot Philadelphia so desperately needed. The Blazers ran out the clock and won their first NBA championship in their young 7-year existence. Coach Jack Ramsey finished his first year with the Blazers with an NBA title, and he justifiably had nothing but praise for his players.
This is the finest team that I've ever coached. These are the finest people that I've ever coached, and it's been a real pleasure. If we had not won this, I would have felt the same way. But having won it, this has been my goal since I started coaching professionally, to win the NBA championship, and I'm really happy today.
And so were tens of thousands of Portland area residents. Blazer Mania struck town with fans literally dancing in the streets. The downtown area was jammed for hours, and Portland celebrated its first Major League sports title. And the celebration will no doubt continue through the night.
This is an awesome look back. All right, still ahead, Clackamas County has less than a week to get all of its ballots counted after that barcode printing error. We have an update on how that's going next. Even though Election Day is in our rear view mirror, there is less than a week left until the results are officially certified. The primary went pretty smoothly, you could say, around the state, but we are all waiting to see if Oregon's third largest county will make the cut. Clackamas County has said they will not be giving any more updates on the count until Monday, which is the deadline to certify the election. Since Election Day, hundreds of county workers there have dropped their regular jobs to hand duplicate ballots because the ballots that were sent to voters for May's primary election, well, they had blurry barcodes that machines couldn't read. Over the weekend, the county told us they have not counted all of their ballots yet, but that they will be finished by Monday. Now, okay, I know this might not sound like a big deal to you, but it's getting County Clerk Sherry Hall in a lot of hot water. We've heard from many of you who say she should resign over this. A few of you who say that it's not that big of a deal if the count is slower than usual, as long as it's finished in time to be certified. Well, the Oregonian ran a story over the weekend that we think is worth your time, and it goes over Sherry Hall's years of elections mistakes. After all, she has held this position for 20 years now. Former co-workers say she did not have a good grasp on how to do her job and refused to perform any marriages after gay marriage became legal. Check this out. It says, by the time I left, she had been there 15 years and she still didn't understand how things worked. One elections manager told the paper. Well, I think Sherry likes being an elected official. As for being a county clerk, not so much. Sherry Hall is up for re-election this fall, but the county clerk position is usually not one that gets a lot of attention. Hall has been re-elected every year since 2002, despite a long list of past mistakes that have cost taxpayers hundreds of thousands of dollars. Oregon's two largest counties, Multnomah and Washington, they do not have an appointed county clerk. What they have is professional elections directors who are hired, and then they answer to county commissioners. Well, over the weekend, we got a question from a viewer named Jolene. Jolene asked, what is the process to change the Clackamas County elections clerk from an elected position to an appointed position? Well, Jolene, that would take a vote, and Clackamas County actually took that question up back in 1996 when a measure appeared on the ballot asking if voters wanted to approve a home rule charter. That would have made some changes to the county's structure, eliminating several elected positions, including the county clerk. But here's the thing, it failed for the third time in Clackamas County history. Opponents claimed it would reduce the number of elected officials and put too much government power in the hands of a few people. In voter guide arguments that did not age well, one argument claimed that getting rid of the county clerk would throw election integrity into question. They thought it would increase government costs and pave the way to increase taxes without voter approval. We are going to be keeping a close eye on this fall's election to see what happens when Sherry Hall runs for re-election. Her opponent, Catherine McMullen, has quite a bit of election experience. She has worked as an elections manager for Multnomah County and ran a voter outreach program for Clackamas County. All right, keep sending your questions and your comments to the story at kgw.com. We will finish the show right after this. All right, for this week's Hey Help campaign, we are asking you to donate to Because People Matter. It's a Portland nonprofit that holds an event called Night Strike each week, and it's for people experiencing homelessness. Every Thursday night under the Burnside Bridge, the group offers things like hot meals, haircuts, clothing, shoes, and sleeping bags. If you would like to help, all you have to do is grab your phone, point the camera up to that QR code that's right on your screen, or you can go to kgw.com/heyhelp. And by the way, this is a micro donation drive, so feel free to give any amount you can, no matter how small. It does make a difference. Well, that's the end of our show. Thanks so much for watching. The news at 6:30 with Laurel and David starts now.